Let's record to the cloud. Come on, please do. Okay, let's get started. Welcome, everybody. This is graduate presentations. We've been looking through these for this semester. And we've got 3 presentations this afternoon. Ali Catry is up first. Ali gets a topic of her choice, because she's on the MEM and not doing a thesis. So Ali, you'll be up first, and we'll decide who's got second and third after that. Technically, we've got until 3 o'clock. I don't think we'll need until 3 o'clock. Well, not for Ali.
As Dr. Slattery just said, hi, I'm Ali Catry. I chose my presentation topic on trash and how it affects marine wildlife. And to go ahead and start off with, I just want you guys to soak in and look at this picture right here. Kind of look and see like what you guys can identify inside this albatross's stomach. So this bird in this picture was taken at Midway. And it was dead on the beach, and there's an artist who goes over there and takes pictures of the animals, specifically seabirds that have died. And like I said, as you can see, like right in the middle, there is a lighter. And I don't know for all of those who can see it in here, there's a couple bottle caps and other random pieces of plastic located inside the bird. So what is waste? Waste is defined as elimination of discarded as no longer useful or required after the completion of a process. And that's just the technical term of what waste is. And there are 7 different types of waste. One of them being liquid or solid waste, and an example of that, which is wastewater. There's hazardous waste, and that can include antifreeze, byproducts from cars, and things along that nature. There's also medical and clinical waste, which is needles, kind of a popular topic right now, but it's also masks and things like that from COVID. And then another one is electrical waste in the day and age that we live in right now. That is also a trendy type of topic when it comes to waste, because we are having difficulties figuring out how to get rid of electrical waste, such as computers, printers, and all of this. And then another type of waste is recyclable waste, which is more cardboard, paper products that can be recycled. And then there's construction and demolition debris. And the most common product that comes out of construction is concrete, and that, as we all know, is a very important thing that goes into our buildings and our structures, but it is also very difficult to dispose of. And then lastly, there is green waste. And green waste, for those who don't know what that is just waste that comes from natural products. So grass clippings, leaves, and those kinds of things, but does not include like dried leaves and hay and that. And so here's a picture just as a representation of how waste can find its way into the ocean, specifically through rain and wind. Is a big one because it will carry down the waste into either streams or into lake systems that will eventually get its way down into the ocean. Another way and means of transportation for this waste and trash and plastic specifically is through storm drains. And there is not really a way to stop that unless we reduce our consumption of plastics, trash, and all that kind of thing. And so, and as you get into this picture and into the pieces of the ocean, you can see that the trash can entangle animals. There's boats and nets that cause a lot of trash and can entangle the animals as well. And then you have microplastics, which I'm going to get into in a little bit later on into the presentation, but all forms of trash can interfere with marine wildlife through, as I said earlier in the slide, ingestion, entrapment, entanglement, starvation, and poisoning. And those are just a couple examples of how that can interfere with the marine wildlife. And so, as I said, I'm going to specifically talk about microplastics. So microplastics here is defined as non-specific small pieces of plastic less than 5 millimeters in length. And in this specific picture, you can see the different types of microplastics. So you have microbeads, scrub, microbeads, detergent, nurdles as pebbles. You have secondary microplastics, tire dust, and nurdles and flakes. And it's kind of hard for you all to see in the room, but they're all just different shapes and different sizes of microplastics. And so the size of microplastics can make it extremely easy for marine wildlife to ingest it because it is so small and it is found all across the ocean. As you can see in these pictures, that's someone's fingertip and it has like so many pieces of microplastic just from there. And so why is it important to be aware of microplastic ingestion? There's many reasons, but I'm going to list a couple of them here. So there's a high bioaccumulation risk. If an animal eats it, and then we eat the animal, that obviously gets back into us. It affects all levels of the food chain. There's a high risk of poisoning from the toxic chemicals found inside the microplastics. And then, like I said, it'll eventually find our way to humans through ingestion. And so I have a little diagram right here. So they're about microplastics. So primary microplastics are things that are originally thrown away and is a bigger piece of microplastic. And then you have secondary microplastics, which are ones that have been broken up and are a lot smaller than the primary ones. So you run into the issue of microplastics are so small that then they become smaller over time. And so the sources are domestic, industrial, and coastal. And it just lists the marine bios that are affected, which again, like I said, is all of them. And so obviously hearing all this is extremely horrible and awful, but there are some measures that are being taken to control the microplastics in the ocean and the spread of it. So one of those can be adopt strong legislative rules and policies, ban on microbeads, establish a really good and strict, stringent waste collection system, carry out dedicated research, and there are so many ways that we need to get creative in order to make sure we reduce the microplastics as they get, or as so many are already inside the ocean right now. So if humans do not stop using plastics, scientists are predicting that by 2050, more plastics will be located inside the ocean than fish because we are increasing our rate of plastic each year. And so that's a very startling statistic that there's going to be more plastic in our ocean than there is fish. Another one by 2050 is there's going to be a permanent layer of plastic found within our rock layers. And plastic continues to accumulate inside those layers. And when you look at rock formations now, you don't see that footprint that the plastics are leaving. And in this picture, it's not the rock layers, so to speak, but it's plastic stuff within the soil. And then lastly, I found this to be one of the more startling statistics, but 67% of edible species caught, more than 25% of will have plastic found within them. So again, this goes back to the bioaccumulation risk into humans because we eat and have a diet that some people, depending on what their diet is, will eat fish, and that will find the plastics will be found inside the fish. So there are, like I said, solutions and regulations and things like doing that into helping reduce the plastics found within the ocean and microplastics, as I said. So reduce your use of single-use plastics, which includes bottles, straws, utensils, things that will only be used once. Recycle properly, make sure you are able to separate your trash and your waste into the proper different categories that are needed to make sure it gets disposed of properly. Participate and or organize a beach and river cleanup, which doesn't have to be this big organized thing. You can also go out yourself and do it, or you can partake, as you see in this picture, of people going out and doing it. Support bans and specifically single-use plastics, which kind of goes along with the first one about reducing your use of single-use plastic. and then avoid products containing microbeads, which a lot of people don't really understand where the microbeads are found in, and it's in everyday products such as toothpaste, face scrubs, body washes, things along that nature. It's a lot in the health and the beauty product world, and that specifically is one of the larger producers of microplastics. Spread the word and educate others. This is also extremely important because a lot of times people don't know, as I said, where microbeads are found, and if you educate them, they're willing to potentially reduce their use and their risk. Reduce their use and their that kind of thing. Will go into buying more eco-friendly types of products, beauty products, and things along those lines. And then lastly, support organizations addressing plastic pollution. And I just listed a couple that are specific with like single-use plastic and things that have to do with microplastics. And so to put all of this in perspective, everybody, this picture just really puts into fact that, so this all of the oceans here listed are split into the northern and southern oceans. It's not just the Pacific Ocean, it's not just the Atlantic Ocean, and we even have the Mediterranean Sea. But I went ahead and highlighted some of the larger oceans that are found with pieces of plastic. As you see, the largest one is the North Pacific Ocean. It has 2 trillion pieces of trash and 192.8 million pounds. And that's just the northern part of the Pacific Ocean. And then you have an ocean as small as the Indian Ocean that has already 1.3 trillion pieces and 188.3 million pounds. And that just kind of describes to you that it's so much bigger than we realize. There's so much trash that we don't know what to do with. And if we don't continue to learn and to be able to reduce it, it's just going to continually grow. And that is obviously a massive problem for us specifically, for the wildlife involved. And if we don't do anything, our world is going to look completely different than it does now. But yes, does anyone have any questions specifically?
Okay, thanks, Ellie. We'll give you a round of applause. Questions for Ellie? Chime on in on the home front, Andrea.
I just have one question. When you were talking about the microplastic sources, you said there
I
was.
can go back to.
Okay, yeah. I was just wondering. I think it's like domestic,
Yep.
industrial and coastal. So what would be an example of it? Is it like those things in the coastal area?
Yeah, so domestic is obviously like the home front, the living front, that kind of thing. Industrial is our businesses and that kind of thing. And then coastal waste is more along the lines of kind of like the fishing industry.
Oh,
And so anything, and then it also connects with the business side as well. So, yeah, if there's any other questions.
So who are the biggest plastic polluters? When you look at that last diagram and you see it on an ocean perspective, if you were to put up some bubble charts on countries, were you able to look at that? Is it a developing world issue? Is it a developed world issue?
So specifically, actually, we talked about this in issues, so I didn't really focus so much on that for my presentation, but I know that a very, very large plastics and waste producer is India, because they do not have a very good trash and waste program over there, and that has to do with the fact that they are heavily populated. It is kind of a developing country in the sense that they don't have the knowledge and the information that we have to be able to create a good waste system that would work for them. But yeah, India, as you can see, like I said, in Indian Ocean, it's so small and it produces so much waste in that specific. Yes, Kate.
Out of the, your slide with the control measures, would you say that any of those are more important for us to prioritize now, or?
For me, I think that they're all important in their own ways. And I think that there needs to be a stronger legislative and policies way to be able to at least get that out there. And then we'll be able to enforce that and then kind of branch out to the other ones that are maybe not so specific or harder to control and measure. But to be able to enforce the laws, then people are going to follow them in hopes that the government is passing laws. So people, citizens should be able to follow the laws. So that's kind of the more important one. But like I said, they all are important and have their own steps and means and ways when reducing the plastics and microplastics. Other questions? I don't know if I can see on here.
Gehendra, you're alive down there. Any questions?
Oh, I'm good. Thank you.
Voice from the deep. All right, great. Thank you, Ellie.
Oh, yeah, and I was just coming about big weapons burgers. They're jellyfish.
They're cheeseburgers. Let's get Betty. I am still hopeful that this is a thesis proposal on geomorphology. I'm hopeful. All right, ladies and gentlemen, next up is Professor James McGee.
All right, so I'm James McGee, and my research is on how bats are used in swimming pools on game reserve in South Africa. So the first thing is, why do bats matter? Why do y'all care about them so much? They provide a couple different services, including seed dispersal, pollination, pest control. They're also important for ecotourism. The Carlsbad Caverns, it's estimated the bats bring in about $3.5 million a year just in ecotourism, so that's a big part of it. They're also important as bioindicators. So the more abundance and diversity of bats you have in an area is a good indicator of how healthy that ecosystem is. The more complex the environment is, the more resources that environment will have, and then it can support a larger number of species. So what resources do they need? So they need roosting sites. So this could be caves, the hollows in trees, underneath the bark on trees. They need foraging opportunities, whether it be fruit, insects. Some bats eat fish and frogs. There's also vampire bats. Water sources, so your natural water sources, streams, lakes, ponds. Like all animals, they need mating opportunities. And then they need something to connect these different resources, so your movement corridors. So habitat quality, you have your natural habitats, which are basically untouched by humans, and this is thought to be best quality habitat. The next, you have your semi-natural habitats, where we have changed the habitats, but we've allowed them to revert to a more natural state. And these are particularly important in anthropogenically dominated landscapes. So like Central Park in New York City, it provides a lot of species diversity to an area that's dominated by anthropogenic lands or features. And then your urban habitats is generally considered to be the lowest quality habitat, but there are some species that thrive in those habitats, such as bats. So they've been seen using attics and wine cellars or even pool umbrellas for roosting sites. For water, they've been seen drinking swimming pools, livestock troughs, and retention ponds. And then for movement corridors, they've used fences, walls, hedgerows, and even tree-lined roads to move between the different resources. So they're pretty resourceful. The problem is we don't know a lot about how wildlife uses these anthropogenic resources in natural and semi-natural habitats. There have been some studies that show that they can enhance the habitat, and of course, any enhancement would be useful. But we want to know how wildlife are using alternative resources in natural and semi. So South Africa is a great place to do this type of research. Europeans arrived in 1652. And when they arrived, they started changing the landscape from the natural habitat into agricultural fields. But in the 80s, they shifted away from agriculture and started moving towards ecotourism. With that shift, it allowed a lot of the habitat to start reverting to semi-natural habitat. So these are the questions I want to answer with my research. One, are bats coming near the swimming pools Are they using the swimming pools as a feeding resource or a drinking resource? And is that resource use species specific? And is it season dependent? So my actual study area is Amakhala Game Reserve. It's in the Eastern Cape of South Africa. It started in 1999, originally with 6 private landowners, but now they're up to 10. Was predominantly used for livestock before, and since they've started the game reserve, it's started to revert to semi-natural picking. So there are some native species there, but they also manage for a lot of different species, including lions, cheetahs, rhinos, elephants, hippos, giraffes, several species of antelopes. And this is a map of the actual game reserve. So the green is the boundary. There's only 9 lodges shown on this, which are the yellow dots, because only 9 of them have swimming pools. Bush Lodge Venture has plunge pools, which are small little pools connected to each little cabin. The blue dots are watering holes, both natural and man-made. And you can see that they're mostly in the southwest, but there are some in the northeast as well. And then also in the northeast is Bushman's River, which is a natural water source, but it does dry up during drought season. And then the red dots are the 2 lodges that I'm looking at, Woodbury and Leeuwenbosch. So this is a picture of the pool at Leeuwenbosch. It's got straight edges, it's chlorine treated. You can see it's kind of isolated, it's not attached to any buildings. And then there's 2 pools at Woodbury Lodge. Again, they're straight edge, chlorine treated, but these pools are actually connected to buildings. And you can also see that there's a lot of trees around the lodge itself. So the first part of my research is looking at acoustic surveys, which is measuring the high frequency echolocation calls of bats. With that, we can determine if bats are present, what activity they're engaged in, and what resources they're using. And using those 3, we can determine the overall quality of the habitat for bats. So there's 4 distinct calls. First one's commuting, which isn't shown here, but commuting is steady calls that get louder as it moves closer to the detector and then quieter as it moves away. The next one is your search phase. Again, it's a steady call, but you're only actually hearing every other call because the bat's turning its head side to side as it searches. Then we have the approach phase. The calls start to get closer together as the bat gets closer to whatever resource it's trying to use. And then the final is the terminal buzz. At the end, the frequency will shift up or down depending on the species, and the calls get very, very close together. There's 3 different types. There's landing, feeding, and drinking. With the feeding buzz, it'll sound like a little raspberry sound at the end as it catches the prey. And with drinking, you can often hear a splash of water when the bat actually comes in contact with water. So to do this, we need SO4 acoustic detector with an ultrasonic microphone, external microphone. The microphone will be pointed towards the pool. Record between 5 p.m. and 7 a.m., which is when most of that activity will take place. And then we'll record the files on SD cards and hopefully download them so they're accessible to us here in the United States, so I can analyze them. When I analyze them, so first thing we do is scrub out any noises because it does pick up other animals than just bats. And then I'll sort the calls by activity. So I have a folder for terminal buzzes, which is further split out between ones I know are drinking buzzes and which ones are feeding buzzes. I also have a folder for approach phase. This terminal and approach phase are the ones that are letting me know they're using something in the area as a resource. And then everything else goes into its own folder. I'll identify the bat species using Kaleidoscope software, which has an auto ID function, but I'll also manually ID the terminal buzz calls and the approach phase calls. And to do that, I made this bat identification guide. There's 22 species that historically have been in the area. There's another 10 that we think could move into the area based on climate change and the species moving towards the poles. So for an example, you have your long-tailed serotin right here. That's its beautiful face. Has a low frequency of 32 kilohertz, a high of 42 kilohertz, duration of 5.5 milliseconds, and then the shape of the call is a hockey stick. There's other shapes as well. For horseshoes, it looks like a staple with a much higher frequency, closer to 100 kilohertz. There's also pills, which are just basically straight lines. The bats will shift their frequency when there's more than one bat in the area, so they're not overlapping their calls. So that can make it a little tricky to identify the species. So the next part is behavior observation. To do this, we'll need a thermal camera connected to a laptop through an Ethernet switch. In this picture, we have a car battery as the power source, but hopefully an Omiclog needs to plug into an outlet one of the lodges. And then we'll need the SM4 with the external microphone again. So I'm hoping to go twice, once June and July of this year, and then November, December of this year, which would give me winter and summer respectively in South Africa. So first thing we'll do, record weather data. We'll start recording about 20 minutes after sunset when the bats start to get active. And then we'll record until activity dies down, usually about an hour. Once I go through the acoustic data a little more, and if I can find a time when they're active again, 3 or 4 in the morning, when they're coming back, getting a drink before they go to bed, I'll try to go out then as well. So we'll convert the files to MP4s, and then I'll use Studio Code software to analyze the videos. It is a little difficult to see the bats in real time, so we'll have to do that afterwards. And then we'll compare what we see visually with the acoustic data. So if I'm seeing a bat go down drain, I should also hear it go down drain. And this right here is actually a splash of water. That's a terminal or drinking buzz. So outcomes, I think I will find bats are coming near the pools. I'll find that the bats are using the pools as a drinking resource. There might be some difference between Lewin-Bosch and Woodbury. Could be because of resource availability. Remember, Woodbury has Bushman's River near it, but it's not always, doesn't always have water running through it. And then also the pool characteristics. So they are both chlorine treated, straight edge, but Woodbury is closer to a building. So I think lighting from the lodges might be an issue with Woodbury. And then hopefully, if we go over there this summer, we can set up acoustic detectors at watering holes, which would also start collecting data for the next step of this, which would be comparing the activity of watering holes to the activity of swimming pools. And then I'd like to thank my committee members, Amicala Game Reserve, for helping me and letting me do this research, and then my classmates. Question.
11 seconds longer than Ellie. That's impressive.
Did I actually do it one time?
11.
Good job.
Yeah, good job. Okay, questions for James?
I have a question.
Yes.
So, I know you said you're gonna be comparing later on in the process, your process of research between the watering holes and the pools. I did have a question though. Is there any type of research that y'all are doing that will, I guess it would be kind of difficult, but to figure out maybe like the effects of like chlorine on the bats and stuff like that?
So there's been no studies that have found that chlorine affects anything from drinking it. Olympics swimmers, like really old Olympic swimmers, have been in the pools for ever. Have had some issues, but so far there's nothing to show that wildlife is affected by it. And we have seen bats drinking from chlorine pools. The chlorine does, because of the chemicals coming off the pool in the air, we think it's making insects stay away. So that's why I'm not expecting to find bats foraging above the pool. Because insects won't be above the pool.
Is salt water just makes you stay away from salt water?
They drink from saltwater pools too, and mineral, but you know, saltwater pools they're not like the ocean. So
Yeah.
I think Izzy's research, they prefer mineral pools than others. Yes.
But hopefully this will be an easy question. And then can we give critique?
Sure.
Okay. So first the question. So could you just situate where your study lies within the literature? So thinking, the one thing that I was thinking about as you're, because now I have a more complete understanding, because I'm on the committee, I've read the proposal, and then we've had the different notes last week, but I didn't get all the presentation, and that's some of the specifics. But in terms of the software, right, that's really helping you do this analysis. So where are we in terms of learning about all of these different phases, the sounds of bats, and all of those things? And I assume that you can't do that without this equipment.
Yes, yeah. So what's your question?
So in terms of the literature, like how new is this? I mean, how, in terms of our understanding
Okay, so yeah,
of,
we've been
and where does your piece fit within that wider body?
So there is a lot of research on calls, but most of it is in the United States and Europe. So there's less in Africa, even though there's way more species of bats in Africa as compared to North America. So I think it'll be adding on to, there are studies that, I'm getting data from someone. So there are studies, but there's not a lot. And so just adding on to it. And then, like I said, with the bats changing frequency, depending on who they're around, it makes it a little difficult. So I am curious to see how much the Kaleidoscope auto ID lines up with what I'm going to find.
Okay, cool, good. Good answer. And then could you just scroll back just one item here, and maybe this is me. So on this one, it was playing earlier. One of them, it was playing. So just in terms of situating your audience, you might just point that out and say, okay, here's a bat coming in and drinking from this pool. The other thing that I would suggest is that you do it once, 2, 3, 4 times while you're explaining it, and then you stop it. Because maybe it's me, but my mind just kept watching this and watching it and watching it. And then I forget, oh, James is talking. I need to listen to him. So you don't want your audience.
I was hoping to see like an eagle swoop in.
Something else is going to happen there.
Yeah.
So that way,
Doing any research, we saw owls fly through. No eagle, but the owl is pretty impressive. When you're looking for the little bitty bats and these huge owls.
Cool.
Cool. Dr. Carell, anything from you?
Good presentation. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Let me stop that share. Yeah, did Holly say she was coming back?
I think so. She left the door open. She left the- yeah, she didn't say anything. She might have just run.
Yeah, every time I look at your like so gives me the pleasing with this first slide, it's all like green and
Save the
like,
world, that's why. Only one side, that's it.
there you go.
Yeah, it's actually really good. Yeah. Josh, you're not. I've got a wall.
It's just her over-demanding supervisor. And last but not least, the great Kate Howe.
Hi, I'm Kate Howe, and today I'm presenting on my thesis topic, which is drivers and barriers for environmental sustainability practices in small manufacturing businesses. So, to begin with, since the Industrial Revolution, humans have been using up our planetary resources, and alongside this as well, we've seen businesses increase both globally and in the US. And with businesses increasing, they need these planetary resources to improve and improve and increase. And alongside that, in order to try and mitigate the effects of them potentially running out of planetary resources and suffering, it's important that they potentially implement these sustainable business practices in order to mitigate the effects that they could have if they run out of planetary resources. So sustainable business practices in this instance, I'm thinking of environmental sustainability. So this is things like waste, water, raw materials, and energy as just a few examples. And small businesses in general, there's less research on them. A lot of the research is actually on larger businesses, and this is globally. But actually, within the US, there's even less research available on small businesses. But what do I mean by small businesses? So in America, the Small Business Administration define these as businesses with less than 500 employees. But with that in mind, that there's not much research, if we actually look at an industry, specific industry such as manufacturing, what we find is that there's even less research available, and this is also apparent in the US. So manufacturing, though, they're quite key. They're key in the supply chain, producing all these products, and so they're using a lot more of our planetary resources. So their impacts include things like impacts to air, water, and raw materials. So it's quite key. What we also find, and I found in the literature, is that there's these different drivers and barriers and characteristics that can actually influence a company's decision-making when they're thinking about implementing these sustainable business solutions. So I'm going to explain drivers and barriers on the next slide, but just to summarize quickly, characteristics, I'm thinking of things like the age of the company and number of employees and their annual sales, for example. We'll go into a bit more detail on those in future slides. Here we are, the barriers and drivers that could affect uptake of sustainable solutions. What we can see, these are things that I've drawn out of previous literature. So some of these are from America, and then some of them are from other small business literature. And I'm finding that some of these, for example, regulatory and economic, can actually be a barrier and a driver for these small businesses implementing sustainable business solutions. So I just thought I'd raise a few of those to your attention. But I talked about America and in general, but how about in Texas as a whole? So I'd like to bring some figures, draw some figures to your attention. This is showing you the total number of small businesses and total manufacturing small businesses within Texas and the Dallas-Fort Worth MSA. And to start with, this figure here for Texas, so 2.8 million small businesses, is responsible for over 90% of small businesses within all businesses, within Texas. So 90% of them are small businesses. And then actually small manufacturing in Texas. So at 50,000, over 50,000, this puts Texas as the second state for the number of manufacturing businesses. And I'd like to just draw your attention as well, that when we then look at these figures, the majority of manufacturing businesses within Texas are small businesses. And then this figure here for DFW Metroplex, actually at 5,000, puts DFW at 7.3%. This is responsible for 7.3% of the regional economy by employment. So with this in mind, it starts to draw your attention, capture your attention to just how important small manufacturing businesses are to Texas, which made me realize, identify this problem. But there's actually little research focused on environmental sustainability practices in small businesses within Dallas-Fort Worth, Arlington, MSA. And there's lack of clarity on what environmental sustainability practices are used by manufacturing establishments within the MSA. And there's no research within this locality to understand what barriers and drivers are influencing these firms' decisions. So to address these, I identified these objectives. Firstly, what environmental sustainability practices have small manufacturing establishments implemented? And what barriers have caused these companies to omit this implementation of environmental sustainability practices? Or potentially what drivers may be an influence? And also to investigate to what extent do firms' characteristics explain their adoption of environmental sustainability practices. So these objectives led me to identify my purpose statement, which I've split into two sections. Firstly, to analyse sustainable business practices of small manufacturing establishments in Dallas, Fort Worth, Arlington, NSA. And then my second part of my purpose statement is to investigate fundamental characteristics of perceptions in affecting firms' decisions for implementing sustainable outcomes. And I would like to go over my methods. So firstly, my sample population. I'll be sampling small manufacturing businesses within the Dallas, Fort Worth, Arlington, NSA, which is located in the northeast of Texas. And it's comprised of these 11 counties. And I'm investigating small manufacturing establishments, which are defined by the Small Business Administration as less than 500 employees. So I needed to understand just how many small manufacturers were actually in this area. So using some public data from the US Census Bureau, I identified the number of establishments per employment size, and it gave me a total population of 4,759. So with this in mind, I couldn't necessarily go in and investigate all these businesses. So I needed to understand a representative value, a true value for the population that would give me a representative sample of that entire population. So to the total population, I used the confidence level of 95% and a confidence interval of 5% to identify the sample size I required to represent my total population would be 356. And what you can see down here, I'd just like to draw your attention that this would be a private data set that I'd use to identify my respondents, basically. And you can see that it would allow me to understand the employee size of the company and different characteristics, and would allow me to gain contact emails to complete my survey, which is part of my methods. So like I said, I'd be emailing these companies this survey. The survey would comprise of a questionnaire, which would allow me to gather quantitative and qualitative data for analysis. I'm going to split this questionnaire up into three themes: sustainable business practices, business characteristics, and barriers and drivers, which we'll discuss in the next few slides. So to begin with, these characteristics, my questionnaire will start to identify these specific company characteristics. And as you can see, previous research has also asked these similar questions in similar studies. And again, more company characteristics. I'd also just like to draw your attention to the small business certification over there, which would be quite interesting. It's not something that I've found in the literature yet, maybe because it's quite specific to America and certifications, but it will really start to help me understand as well the social side of this that I'm not necessarily aiming at, but start to understand how social aspects may be influencing environmental sustainability. And then the sustainable business practice, I'm really wanting to investigate some key things that I just wanted to draw your attention to. So looking at, how the company may be reducing energy and carbon use, potential water efficiency measures in the company, waste reduction and circular economy, and then also thinking of environmental management and stewardship. As I draw your attention to before, the barriers and drivers. So I just wanted to highlight these to you, some of the barriers that I'd like to investigate, and I'd also like to open these up so that there may be ones that the literature so far hasn't identified. So I'm going to open this up with some qualitative, open-ended questions in the surveys. But these are just a few, and I'd like to draw your attention again that things like economic barriers can also be a driver. So reducing operating costs can also be a driver. So it'll be interesting to investigate that in the businesses. As part of the questionnaire, I'd like to also use it to identify volunteers. And the questionnaire will be quite open-ended, allowing me to gain more details around the barriers and drivers, and to gain a greater understanding of the views and characteristics of these companies and how they influence sustainable business practices. And through my research, I'm expecting to find some similar outcomes. So within a lot of the research, the small businesses, I tend to find that cost can be a barrier and a driver through the research, and I expect I might see the same here. Again, knowledge barriers. Small businesses don't necessarily have the knowledge or the necessary experience specialized in sustainable business practices to understand them. So I think I might see this as a barrier. Company size as well. I expect that it may potentially increase implementation of sustainable business practices. So I may see a positive correlation there alongside annual sales as well. And then also there's a potential that geography may characterize perceptions of use. This is just a picture of how manufacturing firms are distributed throughout DFW, and the darker areas are where there's basically more of a cluster of them. And there's a potential that I may see that there's specific characteristics here or specific views in maybe certain zip codes that could influence what practices they've actually implemented potentially. So overall, how will my research further future research and also society? So I believe it will develop understanding on how firms can actually sustainable develop and how we can help them do that. It'll establish barriers and drivers for this specific region and sustainable manufacturing. And also, like I say, there's little research at the moment, so it'll be really, really important. And it'll also identify where businesses can improve efficiency and stay within our planetary boundaries. So I'd like to firstly thank my committee members, Brendan, Becky, and Laura, and open this up to any further questions.
Thank you, thank you. 11:29. Apparently everything stayed between 11:14 and 11:29. Very, very interesting. We wedged them. We wedged them. No, that's good. So a question, Kate, is there any sort of industry standard, kind of like a green leaf for small businesses? You've got 5 leaves if you're doing X, Y, and Z, and 3 leaves, you know what I mean? Or is that?
Yeah, there's quite a few out there, both international and American certified, and then falling into different aspects as well, such as like circular economy certifications. So one of the questions, like I said, I summarized environmental management and stewardship as one of my sustainable business themes. I need to potentially open that up to a question to find that out and investigate it, because there's quite a few that they could potentially fall under, which will, I think as well, I'll gain more of a traction on that through my literature review.
Do you have any intention to try and meet with the CEOs or the GMs of these small businesses, the owners, and sit down with them and do a little sort of deeper dive?
Yeah, that's the whole point of hopefully the interview, is start to understand in more depth their views around those barriers and drivers and characteristics, and gain that real honest qualitative information that you wouldn't get otherwise.
Question for you.
Yeah.
So sustainability science and what it purports to do as a field of study is to be solution oriented. So could you characterize the research, or at least what you think the outcomes are going to be, and how that can provide solutions for sustainability moving forward in small manufacturers or small business in general?
So I'd like to think that realistically, it's going to help that us understand that knowledge base and the root causes. So it's not necessarily just implementing those, it's actually understanding the root causes of the knowledge of the business around barriers and drivers and their perceptions around that. So I feel like that is really important to then drive sustainability further. If they haven't got that knowledge in place, or there's something holding that back, like literature and further research can't really carry on, and we're stuck in place almost. Do you think that answers the question? Or?
Anything else, Kate? Dr. Carell?
Yeah, interesting project. One quick question. You have a blend of qualitative and quantitative methods for your data collection. I understand for quantitative, you're using statistics, but for qualitative, how are you going to collect and analyze data? Can you explain your methods?
Yeah, so with the qualitative section, that's going to be some open-ended questions in the survey. So specifically around barriers and drivers, what I've found is that they can sometimes be quite location specific. So taking there's not much research in America, and especially not in Texas in this research topic, we may find that there's unique barriers or drivers or that we haven't necessarily identified yet in the research. So I'm going to allow that through an open-ended question to gather those results. And then also the voluntary interview will gather further qualitative information. So at the moment, I'm planning on using some thematic analysis to investigate that further.
Okay, so just curious, so how many responses would be good enough for your research, for your qualitative part?
Say that again, sorry.
How many responses would be good enough from your interviews or yeah?
Yeah, at the moment, the interview section, I haven't really necessarily investigated that as such. I've looked at the surveys and how many I need back from the surveys, but I need to look into that a bit more. What I've noticed is that there isn't necessarily, if someone's other research, they don't necessarily interview lots and lots of companies. So for example, one of them, they interviewed about 10 in 10 different companies to gain some information. So I may be in that kind of bracket. I also need to think realistically about how much time I've got and time parameters around it myself to include it.
Okay, thank you, Kate. Thank you.
Anything else to Kate? Okay, well, we are done with graduate presentation. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. Thanks, Gahendra. Super duper. Well, lunch it is. Thanks, G. Appreciate you tuning in.
Thank you. Bye.